Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 17th of April. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 418 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. As we will discuss in more detail later this evening, a court in Moscow has sentenced the opposition activist Vladimir Kara-Murza to 25 years prison in one of the most high-profile cases to date of a Russian dissident being jailed for opposing the invasion of Ukraine. The UK government has summoned the Russian ambassador to make clear its condemnation of what it described as the politically motivated conviction of a British dual national. The United Nations Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, has called on Moscow to free Kara-Murza, saying, "No one should be deprived of their liberty for exercising their human rights, and I call on the Russian authorities to release him without delay." Latvia has imposed sanctions on 10 Russian officials involved in the sentencing of Kara-Murza. The Foreign Minister, Edgar Rinkevich, said he would also lobby the EU to impose sanctions. Almost 500 children have been killed in Ukraine since Russia's invasion, according to a report by the Ukrainian Prosecutor General. It said that as of Monday, a total of 1,418 children had been affected. Slovakia will temporarily halt imports of grain and other selected products from Ukraine, a government spokesperson said today, as talks between Ukraine and Poland over grain exports were due to take place in Warsaw. China's Defense Minister, General Li Shangfu, has toured a top Russian military academy on a visit to the Russian capital. It was announced that 20 senior military officers from China will attend a training course there in Moscow in the autumn. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, today read a report to President Vladimir Putin about drills conducted by the country's Pacific Fleet. Shoigu said that more than 25,000 military personnel, 167 ships and vessels, 12 submarines, 89 aircraft and helicopters are participating in these exercises. The US and more than 40 other countries said in a joint statement today that they were deeply concerned over Russia detaining the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and protested against Moscow's efforts to limit and intimidate the media. Slovakia has handed all 13 MiG-29 fighter jets it had pledged to Ukraine, the Slovak Defense Ministry said earlier today. The village of Krasno, which is in Belgorod in Russia, close to the border with Ukraine, came under fire from Ukrainian forces, according to the regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov. Ukrainian forces are finding a growing number of components from China in Russian weapons used in Ukraine. 130 Ukrainian prisoners of war have been released and returned home in a Great Easter exchange, a senior Ukrainian presidential official has said. And the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, will visit Baghdad on Monday, his first trip to Iraq since Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen was a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011, and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament, representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 until 2021, when she was lucky enough to retire. Maureen has also been a teacher and a counsellor, amongst many other roles. Maureen, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm fine. I'm enjoying a bit of warmth in the sun today. It seems like the first day that we've had any of that, so hopefully it'll continue for a while.
Well, that's good that you're up country enough. I'm on the coast and the Har was quite heavy today, but if you're getting some sunshine, that's a good thing. Our first story this evening is that the STUC today welcomed the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, making his first public speech at their conference in Dundee today. The First Minister said that during the SNP's recent leadership contest, he stood and won on a very clear commitment to progressive politics, and now as First Minister, he will unapologetically drive that progressive agenda forward to the benefit of Scotland. Mr. Youssef said it was clear that the need for progressive politics and the need for a healthy trade union movement has never been greater. The First Minister said that in the UK, the whole Westminster system was lurching to the right, to what he described as a reactionary and sometimes downright nasty style of politics that is too often characterised by a race to the bottom. He said it shouldn't be hard to say that working people need help and support during a cost of living crisis. But instead, the UK government seems to relish taking working people on in a fight and trying to sack those who go on strike for better pay. Turning to refugees, the First Minister said that it should not be hard to say that desperate people arriving on our shores, including children, should be offered sanctuary and safety, but instead they are used by the UK government as a political football and often treated in the most inhumane manner possible. Mr. Youssef said that transgender people who suffer some of the worst discrimination of any members of our society should be offered solidarity, love and acceptance, and not scapegoated and marginalised. The First Minister also pointed to the immense damage that Brexit is doing to the Scottish and UK economy and services. He said, "As your First Minister, I pledge this. I will always, always speak out on what I believe to be right. As a minority myself, I will not only stand up for the rights of all, but where possible, advance those rights. I will never tack to the right in the hope it gives me an easier life. I won't wait and see what my political opponents do or say in a situation before deciding how to react. And I will speak up for the fairer, progressive Scotland that I want to see, and I believe the majority of Scotland supports. With your help, we will collectively build a socially just Scotland we can all be proud of." So, Maureen, we'll look at a couple of elements of Mr. Youssef's speech to the TUC in Dundee, to the STUC in Dundee this afternoon. Firstly, it struck me that in talking to the STUC, he would, and I think he did, strike a very different note to the kind of music and language we see from Westminster. Mr. Youssef said that in each of the roles I've had in government, I'm proud to have worked closely with our trade unions. We've not, unsurprisingly, agreed on everything, but I've always appreciated the constructive and open-minded attitude that you've brought to our discussions. The recent NHS pay deal, I hope, is a really good example of what we've been able to achieve together. So I was wondering, this approach of working together is, as I suggest, if it is as I suggest, in sharp contrast to Westminster, where trade unions and the workers they represent are treated as the enemy. Do you think that voters in Scotland, and perhaps elsewhere in the UK, but particularly in Scotland, do you think the voters recognise that difference and that they value that difference?
I think very many do recognise that difference, and I don't know who's coming from Labour or the Westminster government to speak at the STUC in Dundee this week, but it will be interesting to see what tone they adopt. But I don't think it will be anywhere near the very principled speech that Hamza gave this afternoon, building on the platform that he stood for First Minister on. And I think it is an agenda that the trade unions and the government can work together on. Of course, the trade unions will always push for more and more in a particular direction that helps their members. It's the government's job to see what is possible and what is not. But I think in the long term, building the or continuing, I should say, to build the socially just, fair and open government that has characterised the Scottish government will continue, compared, as you said, Andrew, to the hostile rhetoric that's coming out from both major parties at Westminster. So it'll be interesting to see how your correspondents and guests react to the other speeches that will be delivered at the STUC for the rest of the week.
That's a very good point, Maureen. It will be interesting to see. Thinking a little bit further about, if I can call it this, trade union politics, the First Minister also said, and in connection to the point we've just been discussing, the First Minister said that the UK government's open hostility to trade unions and their disregard for industrial relations could not be clearer. He said that the ultimate example of this is what he called the abominable anti-strike legislation. He said that by enabling employers to issue work notices, that legislation attacks the basic right of workers to withdraw their labour. He said the Scottish Government is utterly opposed to the bill, and if the UK Government are hell-bent on applying the anti-strike legislation in Scotland, then the Scottish Government will never issue or enforce a single work notice. He said he will continue to do everything he can to oppose this disgraceful, abhorrent legislation, which has no place in Scotland. So what could or should the Scottish Government do with regard to Westminster legislation like this, which is attacking workers' most basic rights? As the First Minister suggests, the Scottish Government can seek to ignore it by not issuing notices. But should or could more be done, perhaps more creatively using areas which are clearly devolved to Holyrood in which they have competence?
I don't think I'm in a position to answer that. I can't think of examples where that might happen. But as the Scottish National Party representing all parts of Scotland at Westminster, I'm sure our MPs down there will be doing everything they can to amend the bill and stop the worst parts of the bill, and indeed in its entirety, although with an 80-seat majority, it's very difficult for the opposition to do that at the moment. It'll be interesting to see exactly what Keir Starmer does in relation to his party on the bill. Are they going to try and mimic, but in a softer way, the very hard right Sunak government? Or are they going to stand up for their history and their past and previously a basis of their support, i.e. the trade union movement? I mean, you're right to say that the only thing that a worker can do is withdraw his or her labour to make a point. So they have nothing else. So it's really important that basic right of, anybody's study of economics knows should be in place. And negotiation is always the best way forward, and compromise. I mean, politics is the art of compromise, is it not? And I think that if a government is going to serve all of the people, then it's incumbent on it to make sure that their lives are not disrupted. But we've seen with the junior doctor strike, striking over 4 whole days, and what's 194,000 operations cancelled in that period. I just think that's a dereliction of duty of the health minister at Westminster, Steve Barclay, in not preventing that happening. I'm sure the junior doctors, in talking to them, they could have reached a compromise. So I think the way forward that Hamza has laid out is very much better than that which we see from Westminster.
Thanks, Maureen. And in what was clearly, as his first public speech, was a very wide-ranging speech, setting out a great deal of the new First Minister's agenda and his perspective on politics in Scotland, he also talked about the establishment of the National Care Service. He said, "I believe there's a lot of agreement on principle." And he said he also appreciated the concerns that the trade unions have raised, particularly regarding local staffing and local contracts. He said that as a result, the Scottish Government has confirmed that it will be seeking a further extension to the bill's initial scrutiny period. And he said that he's confident that by taking a little bit more time, we will be able to reach a compromise where staff remain locally employed with local co-design and delivery of services, but within a national framework. So rather than rushing it, he's determined to get the National Care Service absolutely right. So those sound like reasonable and laudable ambitions. So do you think is a little bit more time going to be what's needed in order to get the National Care Service absolutely right?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, this is a huge piece of work and a huge change, and it's all about driving up standards of care, not just for our elderly, but the vulnerable in our society. And also, having a standard to that care throughout the country, and not the wide variations in care that there are at the moment. So I think it is better that more time is taken to get it right. I think that's always the right way. Um, but in this case, with its huge complications, it is important for people to feel that they're not told what to do by, Edinburgh, although I think that's grossly exaggerated, and that they do feel that they can local conditions can be taken into the agenda rather than some sort of national way of doing things. I don't think that's the intention of the bill at all, but I think it is important, as I said at the beginning, that standards remain key here, and that the old and the vulnerable are looked after in the best way possible. That, I think is one of the standards by which a country and a government is judged. And I think it's really important to get this right.
Thanks, Maureen. And we'll look at one final aspect of the First Minister's speech at the STUC this afternoon, and we'll use that to expand a little bit on what you were just saying, because at the STUC today, the First Minister announced that plans to enable councils to raise the amount of council tax paid on empty and second homes will be included in a new consultation to help increase housing availability. The proposals could give councils powers to charge up to double the full rate of council tax on second homes from April 2024. The proposed change would bring second homes into line with long-term empty homes from next year. The joint consultation with COSLA will also seek views on further powers to charge more than double the rate on both empty and second homes in future years. Latest figures show that in January 2023, there were 42,865 long-term empty homes in Scotland. The consultation will also ask for views on whether there should be changes to the definition of when a property offering self-catered accommodation becomes liable for non-domestic rates. Ahead of the consultation, the First Minister said, "We want everyone in Scotland to have an affordable home that meets their needs, and this work to improve the availability of sustainable long-term housing opportunities is a core part of that." By recognising the important role councils have in considering local needs, these proposals aim to strike a balance between good housing supply and helping communities to thrive and to benefit from tourism. The First Minister encouraged anyone interested to respond to the consultation. He said the Scottish Government wants to prioritise homes for living in, with a fair contribution to local services from everyone, while recognising the benefits to local economies from self-catering accommodation and second homes. So, Maureen, firstly, this is to be a joint consultation with COSLA. So is this another example of the Scottish Government working in collaboration with other important stakeholders? And it's possibly worth noting stakeholders who used to be completely within the sphere of influence of the British Labour Party in Scotland.
Yes, after the elections, local council elections last year, we have seen a change in the leadership of COSLA. And obviously, COSLA are the ones who will be identifying the properties and deciding what rate of council tax to put on them. But council sort of second homes are already subject in some areas, I think, to a larger council tax, which I think is fair. And it, as you said, I think, Andrew, it's about getting the balance right. There's no point in having loads of tourists coming to an area if there is no one to work in the shops and in the hotels and restaurants and the cafes where people will want to go out and enjoy themselves. So I think in every community it's about a balance. I think in local communities people know the houses that are being talked about, and it's those ones that are perhaps used by a family from far away for a couple of weeks in a year and not let out to tourists for the rest of the time. I heard a lady from the self-catering organisation on the radio earlier today who's saying that, they would be affected. Well, if they're running a business, I don't think they would be, but it would surely be right and proper, I think, to have a look at that if, for example, as I know in some areas, that self-catering organised companies have bought up whole streets, the ones that look out on the sea, for example. I don't think that's fair to a community at all. So it's, as well as COSLA, the consultation obviously is open to everyone, and I think it's really important that local communities put in a reply in response to the consultation, pointing out what's happening in their areas, and making their own suggestions so that all that can be taken on board. And as a minister, I know these consultations are read, perhaps if there are thousands, not all by the minister, but I remember in one consultation exercise going through hundreds, literally hundreds of responses myself before I saw the summary of the consultation responses made up by the civil servants. So I do think ministers and civil servants take that very seriously before finally drafting any legislation.
Thanks, Maureen. As you say, it's an issue that affects different parts of the country very differently, and so I'm sure that as the consultation comes to a conclusion, I suspect that you and I will be discussing what the responses to that consultation have been and where the legislation is going to go. But let's move on now, because Rishi Sunak is being investigated by Parliament's Commissioner for Standards over a potential breach of rules relating to the declaration of interests, and that's related to his links to a childcare firm in which his wife is a shareholder. The Commissioner, Daniel Greenberg, opened an investigation into the Prime Minister on Thursday last week, an update on the Commissioner's website said. The entry says only that it relates to paragraph 6 of the updated Code of Conduct for MPs, which states that they must always be open and frank in declaring any relevant interest in any proceeding of the House or its committees. Number 10 has confirmed it is connected to Koru Kids, which is among 6 private childcare providers likely to benefit from a pilot scheme proposed in last month's budget to incentivise people to become childminders, with £1,200 offered to those who train through the agencies. Sunak's wife, Akshata Murthy, is listed as a shareholder in the company Koru Kids. On 28th of March, Sunak did not mention his wife's interest when speaking about the childcare changes before the liaison committee. He was asked by the Labour MP Catherine McKinnell whether he had anything to declare. No, all my disclosures are declared in the normal way, the Prime Minister told McKinnell. It later emerged that bosses from the company attended a Downing Street reception hours after that appearance by the Prime Minister in front of the committee. It is understood that McKinnell raised the issue with the Commissioner. Sunak does not list his wife's shareholding on his register of interests as an MP, which MPs are required to update promptly. So, Maureen, firstly, these headlines don't bode particularly well for a Prime Minister who promised to, and I quote, lead the world in standards of integrity, decency and leadership, do they?
No, and no, obviously is someone who's got so many interests and so many, or fingers in so many pies, that he hasn't got a clue what they all are. I'm really, really surprised that nobody in his staff or his wife or anybody raised any concerns, or did his wife in fact suggest, oh, we've got shares in one company, why don't you get them to do a pilot? Which to me sounds like what it probably was, what's happened here. But in any case, it's not good. And as I say, it does seem that the Prime Minister and his wife have got so many in shares in so many different interests that they haven't got a clue what they all are.
Thanks, Maureen. And yes, I was going to touch on that with you, without being too glib. Given the Prime Minister and his wife's vast wealth, Should there be? I was wondering whether there should be a separate team established in the Cabinet Office simply to make sure that her and his interests are properly declared. And it struck me that that would be quite a contrast, because the list of ministerial interests is long overdue for publication, having not been updated for more than 12 months, or almost 12 months. The register of interest for MPs has to be updated every 2 weeks. So there seems to be a tremendous mismatch there between the two. And of course, in February, the Cabinet Office Minister, Oliver Dowden, promised the Commons that the register of ministerial interests would be updated before next month. So the clock's ticking quite loudly now. So do you think and of course the other point is that the reason for the register of ministerial interests not being updated is that there was no advisor running it after the resignation of Christopher Geit last year. So does this suggest to you that the entire system of the declaration and management of ministerial interests is simply not fit for purpose?
Well, I can't see why it's not. I mean, the very first thing when you become a minister is you have a new private secretary, and depending on how big your portfolio is, other members of staff, including a diary secretary and whatnot. But what the private secretary puts in front of you and then goes through with you is a declaration of interest forms. Now, if that is happening for ministers in Scotland, given that we have the same civil service, surely it must be happening in Westminster too. And do ministers there who, are just so blasé say, oh, take it, put it in their pending tree and then don't do anything about it? Or have they got so many interests that they need to put it to their accountant or whatever, and it takes months? I don't know. But it is possible to do it. And it's clearly just not being done by Westminster ministers. And as you say, it's probably not followed up by the Commissioner's Office in a timely fashion. So it all leads to the fact that the UK government has been downgraded in terms of openness and transparency on the League Table of Nations, and this all feeds into that idea that Britain is no longer as democratic as it should be, open and democratic as it should be.
Thanks, Maureen. And that's great insight from a former cabinet minister. Thank you. Let's move on now, because Ineos, the company founded and run by the English billionaire Sir Jim Ratcliffe, will build an electric version of its new Grenadier off-road vehicle in Austria. The electric version of the 4x4 will be developed with the Canadian car parts manufacturer Magna, and production is scheduled to begin in 2026. This decision means that the UK has missed out on building a second Ineos vehicle after Ratcliffe, a vocal Brexit backer who is resident in Monaco, chose a French factory for the original Grenadier. It came as AMT E-Power, a small producer of lithium-ion batteries, separately said it was considering building its first factory capable of production at the scale of gigawatt hours a year in the US, rather than in Dundee as previously planned. The company is considering shifting manufacturing from the UK to the US to benefit from American subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act, it told Sky News. The AMT E-Power chief executive Alan Hollis said, unless we make the UK a competitive place for battery manufacturers, we probably won't end up with a battery manufacturing industry in the UK. The first deliveries of the Grenadier vehicle began from a factory in France in December, about 9 months later than initially planned, because of difficulties caused by the pandemic. However, despite British associations with the name, the vehicles have been built elsewhere. Ineos bought a plant in Hambach, eastern France, to build the Grenadier. So, Maureen, the prominent Brexit supporter Jim Ratcliffe's petrochemicals company said in September 2019 it would assemble the Grenadier in Wales, creating up to 500 jobs. But in July 2020, it blamed the pandemic and said that instead the vehicle would be assembled at a former Mercedes plant in France, at Hambach. So, given that Ineos and Jim Ratcliffe already have formed for this kind of behaviour, should we be surprised that the second vehicle they're going to build is going to be built in Austria?
Well, it's very sad, really, isn't it? I mean, Ineos has a big presence in the UK, a very big presence, and even in Scotland at Grangemouth. So to promise these things and then change your mind is not fair to all the people, whether it be enterprise companies or subsidiary companies that might be wanting to feed into them all the work that they have done. But it was interesting that you noted the Inflation Reduction Act, which seems to be having a big effect on where companies put their investments. I saw a report yesterday, I think, about a company in Caithness who are seriously considering whether they should relocate to the States. And I think this is symptomatic of the fact that the Westminster government seem to be completely behind the curve on the issue of greening the economy and carbon reduction and alternative green energy, and just haven't got a handle on how quickly the whole scene, whether it be hydrogen or solar, is moving here. And it does look as if the incompetence of the Westminster government in this issue could cost the country thousands and thousands of jobs, because once you get one or two, then you can get the cluster effect, like you get in Silicon Valley, for example, or around Tayside with computer gaming. So unless a Westminster government moves on this really quickly, it does look as if we're going to lose out. And it's not something that somebody can turn around and say, well, the Scottish government can do something, because in this situation it is not under devolved competence, I don't think. And it really needs to come from Westminster on this issue. So, it's a pity that with Ineos and Radcliffe, it's take from Scotland and give us the polluting Grangemouth plants, but not any building of green cars, although a grenadier and green seems to me a bit of an oxymoron, is it not?
Yes, that's a fair point. Driving around in a large vehicle with the aerodynamics of a filing cabinet, you're absolutely right. I was going to touch on the Inflation Reduction Act with you, actually, because Mike Hawes, the chief exec of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, has warned that more action is needed to ensure the success of an electric car industry in Britain in the face of large subsidies abroad. The Inflation Reduction Act, which offers tax incentives to green companies, threatens to, in his words, suck up all the investment. And the European Union is competing and has also promised incentives to attract electric vehicle makers and other green industries. So do you think, has Mike Hawes struck perhaps on the real root of the problem here, chronic and consistent underinvestment in industry as the very much the hallmark of the UK economy for several decades now?
Absolutely. And when you think of all the grants and funds that we did in the past get from Europe in terms of, for example, paying for ferries. I was hearing today just that Greece has got over £1 billion to green the ferries that serve all its islands. So yes, it just shows you another reason why Brexit has been an absolute disaster, and the British government isn't in a position, it seems, to understand the effects and how it really needs to focus on things like the economy in this bigger way. Inflation could probably be reduced if some of these things were put in place. But they just seem completely neutered at the moment, just so annoying.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. Now then, we'll move on, because the Rutherglen and Hamilton West MP, Margaret Ferrier, is to appeal against a suspension from the House of Commons for breaking COVID rules. Ms Ferrier has appealed to the Parliament's independent expert panel to review her 30-day suspension from the House of Commons, a sanction that would allow a recall petition in her constituency. Any suspension of 10 or more working days automatically triggers a recall petition, which, if signed by 10% of constituents, leads to a by-election. Margaret Ferrier lost the SNP whip over her COVID rules breach and was subsequently charged and then sentenced to carry out 270 hours of community service after pleading guilty to breaching the rules. The breach of the rules occurred in September 2020 when Ferrier developed symptoms and took a COVID test, but the next day went to church and had lunch with a family member. 2 days later, while awaiting the results of the COVID test, she travelled by train to London, took part in a Commons debate, and ate in the members' tea room in Parliament. She then travelled home to Glasgow by train the next morning, a journey that took up to 5 hours, despite by that point having been told that she had tested positive. Ms Ferrier won a majority of 5,230 at the last general election, and second-place Labour now see Rutherglen and Hamilton West as one of their top target seats. So, Maureen, any suspension of 10 or more working days automatically triggers a recall petition, which, if signed by 10% of constituents, leads to a by-election. Now, the 30-day suspension handed down to Margaret Ferrier is very unusual. And so do you think, is she right to appeal it? And do you think might that appeal be successful given the alarm that's being expressed by supporters of Boris Johnson, who one might expect would be punished even more severely than Margaret Ferrier?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Boris Johnson, because that was going to be what I was going to say. This is not just about Margaret Ferrier, it's also about Boris Johnson. I mean, I think Margaret Ferrier will have launched an appeal so that it puts off the day that she no longer has an MP's salary, if because currently the Labour Party are very busy trying to get that 10% of signatures for a recall. So I can see why she's appealed. Whether it's just putting off the inevitable, we will wait and see. But it also means perhaps that the committee will have are more likely to have made decisions on Boris Johnson then. So I can see exactly what her tactics are, but it'll be interesting to see if Boris Johnson gets the same treatment as Margaret Ferrier. And of course, the vote has just been in the committee so far. It does need to go to the full house, doesn't it? So, I think this will be an ongoing story for Broadcasting Scotland and others.
Yes, you're right, Maureen. Eventually, all of the MPs will have to vote on the punishment that's handed down both to Margaret Ferrier and possibly to Boris Johnson. But let's move on to our next item now, because people at risk of domestic abuse have been advised to turn off any mobile device they want to keep hidden next Sunday, as ministers prepare to launch the first nationwide test of a new emergency alert system. The warning will cause people's phones and tablets to produce a siren-like sound, but there are fears that the test, which takes place at 3 p.m. this Sunday, could give away the location of secret devices. The government has stressed that the alarm will not sound if the phone is switched off or put into airplane mode. The advice was issued after consultation with domestic abuse charities, who warned of the very real risk to those in danger of domestic abuse, many of whom keep second phones as a lifeline that could help them to flee their abuser. The government said that people should follow the Refuge Charity's advice and switch off their devices or put them in airplane mode for the duration of the test. Besides people at risk of violence, the government said people who did not want to be distracted or disturbed, such as people who plan to be driving at 3 p.m. on Sunday, should also disable the feature or turn off their phones. The system sends an emergency alert to devices which will sound for 10 seconds, and a notification will appear that needs to be cleared before the phone can be used again. So, Maureen, do you think is the right balance being struck here between alerting people to threats to life from natural disasters, which is what this new system is intended to do, and the threat to their lives if a secret lifeline phone is discovered or folks crash their cars at 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon when a siren suddenly starts sounding right beside them?
Yes, I don't think this has been as widely publicised as it should be. I mean, I think it should, probably have had adverts on all media warning people that this is going to happen at 3 p.m. On Sunday, because it will cause a lot of consternation when people hear it if they've not been alert to what is coming. And I hadn't worked out for myself the idea that, of course, if you have a hidden phone for domestic abuse reasons, that this could cause all sorts of problems. So congratulations to all the domestic abuse charities for highlighting this. I'm pretty annoyed, really, that the government has got access to all our phone numbers and iPads and what have you in order to do this. For what? I really hope it doesn't lead to an increase in domestic abuse and violence, because that is horrifying.
Thanks, Maureen. Certainly, I'm reminded of the old system. I'm old enough to remember the previous emergency alarm system, which was sirens on top of police boxes in public buildings. And I'm old enough to remember the last time it sounded in Edinburgh, which was the very first night that Mrs. Thatcher spent at Holyrood Palace as Prime Minister in 1979. And by accident, clearly, the emergency alarm system was sounded at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning in Edinburgh. So, as you say, I don't know that this is an advance. But let's move on to our next item now, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, a court in Moscow has sentenced the opposition activist Vladimir Kara-Murza to 25 years in prison in one of the most high-profile cases to date of a Russian dissident being jailed for opposing the invasion of Ukraine. Kara-Murza, who holds a dual Russian and British citizenship and who studied at the University of Cambridge, was detained in April 22 and charged with spreading false information about the Russian army in Ukraine. He was also later charged with high treason over a series of public speeches he made that criticised Kremlin policies and the war in Ukraine. His sentence is the longest yet given to a political opponent of Vladimir Putin, as the Kremlin further steps up its relentless crackdown on dissent. In a final speech to the court last week, Kara-Murza struck a defiant tone, declined to ask the court to acquit him, and said he stood by everything he had said. "I only blame myself for one thing," he said, whom Amnesty International has designated a prisoner of conscience. He said, "I failed to convince enough of my compatriots and politicians in democratic countries of the danger that the Kremlin regime poses for Russia and for the world." Kara-Murza's sentencing, which he compared to Stalin's show trials, was held behind closed doors. After the verdict, Kara-Murza's wife, Evgenia, praised her husband for his courage, consistency, and honesty in your many years of work. The jailed Kremlin critic, Alexei Navalny, strongly criticised the ruling, calling it illegal, unconscionable, and simply fascist. At the time of his arrest last year, Kara-Murza was one of the few prominent opposition figures who chose to stay in Russia. Most, including allies of Navalny, have fled due to safety concerns since the outbreak of the war. Hours before his detention, Kara-Murza appeared on CNN, where he described the Kremlin as a regime of murderers. So, Maureen, given the depth of funding from Moscow to the Tory party, do you think is there much prospect of Vladimir Kara-Murza getting much consular support from the Foreign Office? I know that the Russian ambassador has been summoned in Whitehall, and the British ambassador in Moscow has spoken publicly about this. But I'm thinking that both the depth of the links between the Tory party and funding from Moscow, and of course the new direction that chiefs of mission have been given by the Foreign Secretary, which is to monitor everything that Angus Robertson is saying above all else. Do you think there's any chance that Mr. Kara-Murza is going to get any consular support at all?
Well, it'll be very interesting, Andrew, to see if he does, and the level of support he gets, and how often his case is raised when any minister meets any Russian counterparts. I mean, this is a very serious sentence, because not only is it 25 years long, but I understand it's hard labour, so it's likely to be in a gulag in one of the most horrible prisons in Russia. So it's really, really bad. I mean, and the way he has, acted with such dignity, and his wife too, is really quite heart wrenching, actually. And I'm sure he's the latest in a long line, although not somebody. I've not heard of somebody who has dual citizenship before, but we've all heard of Navalny, but not of Vladimir Karamurza. So, yeah, I think, I hope that Amnesty International and other organizations will be taking up his cause, but it just is another example of how Russia under Putin is completely and utterly, as I think you quoted, a horrible, hard dictatorship. And the sooner he's brought down, the better. But that doesn't look like happening anytime soon either, does it?
Thanks, Maureen. Yes, and your point, it does feel like we're back in the days of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I don't think any of us
Mm.
ever expected would be the case. But let's move to our next item now, because the trial in the closely watched $1.6 billion defamation lawsuit between Dominion Voting Systems and Fox News will begin a day later than scheduled, the judge overseeing the case announced last night, hours before opening arguments were set to begin today and amid reports of settlement talks. The trial was rescheduled to begin tomorrow. Eric Davis, the Delaware Superior Court judge overseeing the case, did not say why the trial was being delayed. The Wall Street Journal reported that Fox had made a late push to settle the case out of court, and Reuters also reported that the delay was due to settlement talks, both citing confidential sources. In a brief court hearing this morning, Judge Davis offered no more details on his decision to push back the start date. This is not unusual, he said to a courtroom filled mostly with reporters. I have not gone through a trial longer than 2 weeks that has not had a day delay. Only one lawyer from each side was present in the courtroom today. A Fox News spokesperson claimed that Dominion was reducing the amount of money it was seeking in damages. The spokesperson pointed to a Friday email in which a Dominion lawyer said that the company would not present a claim on lost profit damages to the jury because it was duplicative of the lost enterprise value damages. In its original 2021 complaint, Dominion claimed $600 million in lost profit damages, in addition to $1 billion in lost enterprise value. Fox News has argued that Dominion is inflating the financial damage it suffered. The damages claim remains, as Fox well knows our damages exceed $1.6 billion, a Dominion spokesperson said in a statement. Dominion is asking a Delaware jury to award damages because it says Fox News knowingly or recklessly disregarded the truth when it broadcast outlandish lies about its voting equipment and systems. So, Maureen, this trial had expected to be a blockbuster, with top Fox News executives, Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch, expected to testify in person, along with top Fox News hosts, including Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, and others. So do you think, with the news of the delay of the start of the trial, are we now going to be denied the chance to enjoy Logan and Kendall Roy, Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch, being skewered in cross-examination?
Oh, I'm sure if the news channels are allowed in, Fox News's opponents and competitors, if they're allowed in, I'm sure they will cover it. I have to confess that I hadn't read about this, although I do remember now that you mention it. When it all started off. So it really is important that news outlets are held to account when they're clearly not telling the truth. But the sums that you quoted are mind-boggling. So it'll be interesting to see what finally is settled in this case, if Rupert Murdoch is still alive, or whether he's not on another marriage or a honeymoon or whatever. Maybe that's the reason for the delay. Sorry, I'm being facetious.
Not at all. 92-year-old Rupert Murdoch, I think, was the age that I read in an article last week. So yes, it's going to be quite a challenge. But let's come back to the UK for our final item this evening, because from today, the Brecon Beacons National Park is dropping its English language name and scrapping its logo of a fiery greenhouse gas emitting beacon as it launches a plan designed to tackle issues in the park created by the climate and biodiversity emergencies. The park in South Wales is now to be known as Banau Brwc Einiog, or informally the Banau. Banau is the plural of Ban, which means peak in Welsh, while Brycheiniog refers to the kingdom of the 5th century king Brychan, so the name translates into English as the peaks of Brychan's kingdom. The name change has caused political debate in Wales, with the Tories suggesting the funds spent on it could have been better spent elsewhere, with the Welsh Conservative Shadow Minister for Mid Wales, James Evans, claiming that the rebranding exercise by the National Park is not a priority for the people or the businesses who operate in the park. Plaid Cymru's spokesperson for the Welsh language said this decision by the National Park is a positive step in normalising the use of Welsh. In reclaiming our original Welsh names, we can reclaim our heritage, which is vital if we want our language to continue to play a role in Wales's future. The launch is being promoted with a stirring short film written by the novelist, poet and playwright Owen Shears, who was brought up in an old Welsh longhouse outside Abergavenny, and featuring the actor and activist Michael Sheen, who hails from South Wales. It is entitled Cinefin, a Welsh word that Shears defines as a landscape which, as you step into it, feels like arriving at your hearth, and opens with Sheen striding across a beautiful hillside. The film, however, cuts to less picturesque aspects of the park, including dumped rubbish, polluted water, and wildfires. The film looks forward to a better future that it hopes the new plan will create: skies filled with birds, dark nights thick with stars, water running with life, not pollution, and young people nurtured by culture and educational opportunities. Explaining why he was keen to be involved in the launch, Sheen said that the park was much more than a place of beauty and inspiration. Welsh names are beautiful, Plaid Cymru's spokesperson for the Welsh language said. They are very descriptive. We're not demanding people use the Welsh name, but gradually it will catch on, hopefully. So, Maureen, is there more significance to this story than simply refreshing the branding for this national park? And associated with that, how do you think the press in Scotland would respond if and when the Cairngorms or Loch Lomond are rebranded with their Gaelic names?
Yeah, well, I think we can imagine what the responses from the mainstream media in Scotland would be, and they're probably looking up those names in Gaelic right now. But as a linguist myself, I find this whole idea that English should be the only language spoken in the United Kingdoms is just an utter nonsense. And I take my hat off to Wales, who over decades now have been promoting their language much better than Scotland has been promoting their languages. I mean, if you fly into Spain, you can, when you get off the plane and switch your phone off, you can choose which language you want out of 4 or 5 of which language you want to be notified in. So as I say, the idea that there's only one language should be dominant is just a nonsense. And I take my hat off to Wales for continuing to push forward with the Welsh language. And I would see no problem in us rebranding the Cairngorms and Loch Lomond national parks. And maybe if we have introduce another one, it can be in the Scots language or Gaelic, which is ever more suitable from day one. But hats off to the Welsh government on this.
That's actually, you make a very good point there, Maureen. I said Gaelic. There's no reason at all that it shouldn't be in Scots or thinking of where you are, in Doric for that matter. Would be singularly appropriate and singularly sensible in the circumstances. So that's a very good point that you make, and hopefully some people from the various national park authorities are reflecting on this news from Wales today and the approach that's being taken. So thank you for that suggestion, and thank you for your thoughts, Maureen. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to continue to develop the station in order that we can make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back tomorrow evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I'm sure everyone else did, Maureen. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. I hope that everyone has a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.